Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Again, it depends on what time you are watching this recorded lecture. So for today, I'll discuss about American Revolution and independence. So I assigned two particular readings for this lesson, mainly Stoughton and Walsh-Reicher and Wood's readings. So Stoughton and Walsh-Reicher talk about the free trade, sovereignty, and slavery, particularly how the mid-colonized America have shifted into an independent nation in terms of economic practices after no, they were colonized by uh, United Kingdom or Britain at that time. And Wood's readings talks about the origins of American democracy and how the people became judges of their own causes, which talks about the general reality how the America was able to shifted into a democratic type of government after that totalitarian at the same time that uh, totalitarian monarchy government has basically left America into shambles or into a political distress. So for today, we will focus on the key events at the same time, the status of America during its colonized period from the Britain or the Great Britain at that time. Okay, so we will first tackle about the American Revolutionary War or the American Revolution for short. So the American Revolution, if you are to compare it with the other revolutions that happened in global history, it is very notable or it is very unique in terms of how it came or how it has an objective. No, it wasn't just purely just focused on removing the particular power or control of the monarchy at that time, no, but rather it was more of an awakening of of ideology at the same time. It's an enlightenment within the Americans in where they wanted to adopt that type of constitution in where it embraces democracy, liberty, and freedom, which was the opposite of how the absolute monarchy of the Great Britain came to be. Okay. So, what makes the American Revolution different from other revolutions in global history? So, besides from what I mentioned earlier, besides it being based on ideological and Enlightenment roots, the American Revolution, which occurred from 1775 to 1783, it stands out from the other revolutions because of its distinctive features, no, or yung mga particular characteristics that define the American Revolution. So first one would be the American Revolution can be considered as a type of colonial versus metropolitan power. Meaning, unlike other revolutions that happened in Russia, in France, or in African nations like Somalia, the people or the Americans or the early Americans, they actually, they actually uh, were not seeking to overthrow their own king compared to the French Revolution in where they wanted to eliminate or eradicate the Bourbon monarchy. At the same time, sa case naman ng Russia in where they tried to eradicate the um, Romanov family as the last ruling monarchy of Russia before it shifted into the Soviet Union. Ito namang American Revolution, they were trying to overthrow the king that was in Great Britain, particularly removing the control or the dominance of that king towards the American borders. Kumbaga parang nasa external border nila yung king that they were trying to overthrow. Okay? So, second characteristic ng American Revolution would be, again, we go back to its uh, major influence, which was more of the ideological roots, and it came from the Enlightenment thinkers or Enlightenment traditions. At pag sinabi natin Enlightenment tradition, syempre, ang pinapasok nating mga tao dyan when it comes to influencing the American Revolution, where of course we have John Locke, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we have Montesquieu, and of course many other French revolutionaries that weren't really much of known in French Revolution. So the revolution that was, of course, happening in America were transpired by many Enlightenment ideas, no? Particularly yung tinatawag natin na natural rights. Pag sinabi natin natural rights, dyan pumapasok yung right to life, liberty, property, right to life and humanity. So itong mga particular rights that transcend within the personal and sabihin natin internal aspects of humanity. Okay? And besides that, we could also incorporate yung importance ng popular sovereignty. So when you speak of popular sovereignty, there is a merging role or a very important role between the government and the people. And pagdating sa pagkontrol ng sovereignty, it's not just largely dictated or defined not by the state or the government, but rather by the people themselves. Because the people have the right to select who will govern or who will become the leader of the state or the community. At dito pumapasok yung yung right to suffrage or right to elect and vote ng mga tao, which wasn't really practiced during the reign or the control of the Great Britain over America at that time. And another important ideological um, uh, idea that was embedded towards the American revolutionaries. So ito yung tinatawag nating limited government. So pag sinabi nating limited government is we are trying to be let's say restricting of the government's possible action of being oppressive in terms of its power. Pagka ginamit kasi ng government natin yung yung power nito in terms of let's say enforcing the law or sabihin nating sanctioning people if they do horrendous or let's say uh, inhuman acts towards the society, dapat meron pa rin tayong checks and balances that comes with it. Kaya pumasok dyan yung influence ni Montesquieu about the separation of powers between the branches of government. Okay? Kasi during the absolute monarchy reign of Great Britain, it was purely the monarch, the king, and of course his council of advisors who were just in charge of imposing taxes, of imposing laws within the American territory. Okay, so yung natin, yung ideological roots or Enlightenment influences that came from the Enlightenment period thinkers, this gave more a legalistic and constitutional tone or theme compared to the radical social upheavals of the Great Britain monarchy, right? Okay, so what is another distinct characteristic about the American Revolution is yung limited social revolution that happened. Kasi if you are to compare with the French Revolution and compare natin sa Russian Revolution and yung mga nangyaring uprisings in the African region at that time kasabay nila is itong American Revolution is considered to be a radically appended type of revolution, meaning gusto nito i-end yung mga feudal privileges, yung mga feudal practices, at the same time yung slavery. Because slavery was highly practiced during the colonization of Great Britain. Right? Besides that, the American Revolution was more politically than socially transformative. Meaning, it wanted to eradicate the overpowering of the elites, which were the which were the planters or sila yung mga nakuha ng mga slaves from African nations. At the same time, yung mga merchants who were overly practicing of consuming goods at the same time selling them into American markets in a much higher price. Of course, yung mga lawyers at that time, which were mostly elites na galing sa Great Britain, these are particular actors that were targeted by the American Revolution. Because these elites were basically limiting, at the same time restricting the freedom and the actions of the American people at that time. Okay? And lastly, the most important the most important characteristic of the American Revolution, or how it transformed America before, is of course the creation of a new republic, or the new government that we call it. So, pag sinabi natin creation of a new republic, the Americans did not simply replace one monarchy with another strongman or another government. But rather, they experimented or tinry natin nila yung tinatawag na republicanism, and at the same time, they also tried federalism. So, itong dalawang types of government na to are based on a written constitution, which we will discuss further on. Kasi of course, they wanted to have an embodiment or legality within these things that they fought for. And with that, the only legal measure that could strengthen these goals or objectives of them is through a constitution. So, nangyari or nagkaroon ng tinatawag na 1787 Constitution, which basically began as their first constitution historically, which became one of the most influential frameworks for governance in the modern world. Kahit sa Philippines, we also took inspiration of the US Constitution from 1787. Okay? Alright, so kanina na-mention ko that the the American Revolution were separate or different from the French and Russian revolutions. Itong French and Russian revolutions, they have made radical changes, no? In the established political and social orders within their respective countries. Pag inano natin, differentiate natin siya sa American Revolution. Yung American Revolution, it established a new nation na independent sa may British rule naman. Pero, in terms of characteristic, itong nakikita nyo sa first picture, this is the French Revolution. Yung French Revolution, if you are to watch Les Miserables, or if you're familiar with Napoleon Bonaparte, this particular revolution aimed to dismantle yung radically restructure France's deeply entrenched political and social systems. At ang gusto nilang eliminate nun is of course sila, King Louis the 16th, and of course, together with his council of advisors and Marie Antoinette or Maria Antoinette. So what they planted was to remove monarchy and of course feudalism within France during that time. Okay? On the other hand naman, yung Russian Revolution, it focused on overthrowing the existing autocratic social order na pinapractice nung uh, mga monarchies at that time. Pero ang nakaka-disappoint lang is yung Romanov family is they are considered to be one of the kindest type of monarchy at that time, family of monarchy. They were actually trying to negotiate and talk with some of the locals at that time who were experiencing famine and poverty. It's just that the Russian revolutionaries were more of angered by the fact na marami na nagugutom, or sabihin nating maraming mga famished among the poor families, and they were more inspired to really eliminate the rule of this monarchical family, and of course shifted into a different type of government na merong socialism na na-manifest dun sa Soviet Union. Alright, so let's now delve on the further details of the American Revolution. So, the American Revolution, this most significant effect na nabigay niya is particularly the formation of a new government. Okay, so yung American Revolution that happened or lasted from 1775 to 1783, it manifested that again, new government that we call it. But we call it. So yung new government na yun, dun siya more of nag-a-apply within the first or earliest 13 most autonomous colonies ng Amerika, which we will delve on later. So yung 13 mostly autonomous states or colonies na under the British rule, they weren't really economically or politically free. Or yung identity nila wasn't really solidified. Okay? So within that 1775 to 1783, they wanted to establish a political and economic independence from Great Britain. And for that to happen, it wasn't really realistic to really just have a negotiation with the British rule, no? Because the British rule were really exploiting at the same time really volatile towards the revolutionaries, no? But you should bear in mind that when we are trying to discuss American Revolution, merong three important matters or concepts that goes along with it. Okay? So number one would be Enlightenment ideas, like we mentioned earlier, that transpired from the Enlightenment period thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And we have the colonial tensions. And we have the global economic competition. Sige, i-highlight ko lang itong definition ng colonial tensions and global economic competition. So pag tinawag natin na colonial tension, so what you should take note is that there was a growing conflict between Britain and its colonies, no? Including dispute over taxation or yung tinatawag nating taxation without representation that happened between the early Americans and of course the British rule. Next would be restrictions on trade because again, trade was a majorly practiced economic transaction during 1770s up to the 1800s, even in the present naman. Pero dito kasi nag-start mag-emerge yung practice ng trade that was discovered to be economically pleasing for people. And of course, military presence because as mentioned, the British rule were so exploitative, they're so coercive towards the Americans or the colonies that were under them, right? And with that, of course, it sparked rebellion over the revolutionaries or the American people. And lastly, we have the global economic competition. So during the time of 1770s to the early 1800s, yung practice ng Great Britain of trade wasn't just limited to them. Meron silang mga competitors na other European countries like France, no? Pati yung Spain. Itong dalawang countries na to were known to be heavy on practicing trade, lalo sa ano no, lalo sa mga raw materials, metals, pati sa mga wood which were largely used for infrastructure at that time. Okay. Alright, so ito yung ano no, ito yung tinatawag natin na original 13 colonies or yung kinote natin as the 13 most autonomous colonies that were under the British rule. So, andito pumapasok yung isa-isahin ko na lang, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay. So kung makikita nyo dito sa may map, they are very close to each other in terms of political geography. Or in geography lang, in a basic sense. But you should take note na itong mga colonies na to, itong 13 states na to as we call it, kasi before, when they had the original 13 colonies, it actually expanded through time, no? Especially nung naging independent na ang Amerika through the Treaty of Paris, after they became free, they expanded into 15 colonies at present. Okay? So the original 13 states of America or the original colonies of America were basically the earliest colonized or British colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America. So, dito talaga yung territory in where the British people focused colonizing and spreading. That eventually declared independence from Britain uh, after the foundation of the United States, which we will discuss on later. All right. So each particular state or each particular colony, they have a very distinct characteristic or role during the British colonization. Ano ko sa inyo, i-discuss ko sa inyo one by one. Pero for now, yung seven na lang muna kasi sila yung may pinaka mahalaga or pinaka distinct na characteristic in relation to the American Revolution and independence. So number one, we would like to highlight Virginia's role. So si Virginia, this is considered to be the largest and most influential colony. Why? Because it is the home to many revolutionary leaders like George Washington, who was the first U.S. president. And of course, we have Thomas Jefferson, who is known for his Jeffersonian act or Jeffersonian uh, concept. And we have also Patrick Henry, who was a very known politician and writer who contributed to the US Constitution. So itong tatlong tao na to are very known to have influenced Virginia in terms of pushing for democracy and independence against the British colonizers. Okay? Right. Second, we have Massachusetts. So si Massachusetts, kung you are hearing about Massachusetts, madalas dyan yung makikita yung, or maririnig yung Cambridge. Siyempre, pagka Cambridge, andyan yung Harvard University, yung Cambridge, yung ano, no, yung MIT or Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who are known to be the top universities of the US. So, dyan sa Massachusetts, it plays a very important role pagdating sa revolutionary resistance. So, this is considered to be the center, no, ng revolutionary resistance because dito nangyari yung tinatawag natin na events like the Boston Tea Party, which is a form of ano no event na dito nang transpire yung revolutionary acts ng mga Americans. At the same time, dito rin nangyari yung first battle or physical battle between the American revolutionaries and the British army. So, dyan nangyari yung battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay? So, next would be New Hampshire. So, which is at the very north or top. So, si New Hampshire naman, dito nangyari yung Declaration of Independence from Britain. At the same time, this is where many of the revolutionaries started to really take shelter. Meaning dyan maraming dyan maraming mga revolutionaries yung naggrupo-grupo or nag-establish ng mga families or communities. Kaya marami dyan sa New Hampshire at present sa mga sa mga monuments or sa mga libingan, maraming mga revolutionaries ang nakalagay or nakasettle. Next would be Maryland. So this is where Maryland is located. So si Maryland naman, it is very known to be as an economically thriving state. Meaning, maraming mga dependents ng economic practices yung nangyayari dyan. Kasi si Maryland, it's very accessible in terms of its agricultural resources because sila, no, yung geographical location nila, it's very advantageous in terms of planting, fruits, vegetables, and even rice. And besides that, si Maryland, it was considered to be a port economy. Meaning maraming mga ships, vessels yung pumapalaon dyan at the same time dyan nagpa-practice ng trade between the other states yung mga revolutionaries and the British colony at that time. Okay, so next would be Connecticut. So dito naman yung Connecticut in between New Jersey and Rhode Island. So si Connecticut naman, it is known for its early constitution. Kumbaga parang dyan first na-establish yung fundamental orders as we call it. Meaning yung tinatawag na self-governance which was embedded within federalism. Dyan unang na-establish yan. Kasi si Connecticut, it has the earliest constitution na pinollow nila as a state which transpired or inspired in many of the other states. So ito yung naging inspiration ng mga revolutionaries at that time. Okay, next we have Rhode Island, which is very small in terms of geographical size. Si Rhode Island naman is the first colony to declare independence from Britain. So very important 'yan kasi si Rhode Island in May 1776, correct me if I'm wrong, nagkaroon sila ng first religious freedom from the influence of the absolute monarchy. At the same time, political freedom na rin. Okay? And lastly, for the important states or 13 colonies of America, so dito pumapasok si Delaware. Si Delaware naman, this is the first state to ratify the US Constitution. Kumbaga sila yung nagkaroon ng contribution in terms of amending or changing the US Constitution from the 1787. Okay? Right, so moving on. Okay, so this is the particular political cartoon that basically represents the revolution or the American Revolution. So this is what we call the join, comma, or die. So I don't know if you have seen this from the social media or any historical books, but the join or die plays a very important symbolic role as one of the most famous political cartoons in American history. So sino ba yung nag-establish nitong political cartoon nito? So ang nag-first establish nito or nag-spread nitong political cartoon na to is si Benjamin Franklin, no? So, he established this political cartoon during 1754, during the French and Indian War. Okay? So, ano bang pinaka naging point nito? So, it later became a powerful emblem during the American Revolution. Ang pinaka nare-represent niyan is different states of America or different colonies of America. Particularly, New England, ito yan. Next would be New York, which is this one. Next would be New Jersey. Next is letter P is Pennsylvania. Next is Maryland for letter M. Next is Virginia for V. Next is North Carolina for NC. And lastly, South Carolina for SC naman. So ano ba ang pinaka naging objective or point ng join or die political cartoon na to? So, as you can see, isa itong ahas, no? Isa siyang snake na cut into 8 pieces na labeled with initials of a colony or a region. Okay? Beneath it were the words join or die. So, ano bang pinaka nire-represent yan? There was a popular belief that a snake, if cut into pieces, it could come back into life pagka-united na yung mga parts niya. So yung metaphor na yan, it reinforced the idea that the colonies needed to be connected to survive or to function. Okay? And with that, na-establish yung tinatawag nating join or die, which is a manifestation for unity for survival. The cartoon sent a clear message, no, according to what Benjamin Franklin wanted to embed. If the colonies stayed divided, they would be weak and easily defeated. But if they joined together, they could survive and defend themselves against the British colonizers. Okay? And this particular political cartoon, it sparked a lot of flame or fire within the Americans, which made them join the American Revolution. So a total of 230,000 Americans actually emerged or fought against the British colonizers. Okay, so going back to the discussion about American Revolution. So, the American Revolution was actually a manifestation of a democratic movement, basically fighting or going against the autocratic or the absolute monarchy rule of Great Britain. It has a bit of similarity with the French Revolution. Kasi si French Revolution, yung objective niya is to, of course, go against the Bourbon monarchy. Pero ang difference lang, again, is ang tinutuligsa or ang inaatake na monarchy ng American revolutionaries is not directly governing within America but outside of America. So the American Revolution, it focused on building America's self-government or federalism, which is nakita nilang practical on their end because uh, the 13 original colonies weren't able to really distinguish themselves or create a political identity on their own because it was too influenced, it was too it was too penetrated by the rule of the British government. At nung time na yon, ang king ng Britain was King George III, which is known to be one of the most oppressing leader of British rule history. Okay? So second, American Revolution was basically a colonial independence movement. And the reasons for it were fundamentally economic. Na-mention sa may reading nila Stoughton that the main reason why the American Revolution was created or established in the first place is for them to create or establish that economic freedom through trade, taxation mostly. And again, economics or taxation are very important when it comes to people, when it comes to public, because it affects their decision when it comes to livelihood, if they should find a job that is high paying for them to pay their taxes, because if not, they will be sanctioned by King George III. Okay, so the American Revolution, third, specifically highlights democracy, freedom, and liberty, which are reflections of America's governmental identity even in the present day. Pagka naririnig or nababasa nyo yung American Constitution, you would automatically constitute these three particular concepts of democracy, freedom, and liberty. Okay? But if we are to go back with the characteristic of America during its British rule control, we should go back to the reality na merong fear of strong central authority ang mga early Americans at that time. For the reason that Britain's King George III was the type of leader who practiced the tyrannical monarchy rule. Okay? They didn't want another absolute ruler. Instead, they preferred democracy over absolute monarchy, where power dito sa democracy came from the people themselves to select or to choose the particular leader who could govern them. Kaya meron silang concept of elections or right to suffrage. Okay, besides that, there is a need to balance unity and independence of states. Kaya babalik tayo dito sa may building America's self-government or federalism. So when you speak of the balance unity and the independence of states, the 13 former colonies were very different. Pag sinabi nating different in terms of economic, social, and cultural aspects yan. So some were geographically large like Virginia, and yung iba naman like yung pinakita ko sa inyo kanina yung balik tayo doon. So Virginia is big, tapos kumpara naman natin kay Maryland, kay Rhode Island, pati kay Delaware, they are very small in terms of geographical size. Okay? And with that, maraming corresponding mechanisms or consequences kasi yan. No? So ano ba ang pinaka-fair or reasonable type of system that they could adopt within these 13 earliest colonies of America? So, a federal system is basically a concept or a practice that allowed the states to keep their local power and identity while still joining together for defense, trade, and foreign policy. Because what you should take note is that even though merong independent identity, economic and political landscapes tong 13 colonies na to, is at the end of the day, they are still obliged or mandated by the US Constitution to unite for defense, trade, and foreign policy areas. Because again, these three areas are what shapes their security as a whole nation, as a whole America. So yung balance for unity and independence of the 13 states, it was very crucial. Kasi pagka merong too much central power, it risked the possibility of tyranny, which was evident during the rule of King George. Okay? But too little power risked disunity. So may possibility na pagka little power, disunity yung mangyayari. Kasi when there is little power, of course, within the 13 states, mawawalan sila ng political confidence with each other. Okay? Alright, so further elaborating yung tatlong highlights or concepts that are embedded here, like the democracy, freedom, and liberty. What we should go back into again is the influence of the Enlightenment ideas. So yung thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and of course Rousseau, they have emphasized different contributions when it comes to the American Revolution or the establishing of the new America. Sige, isa-isahin lang natin. So, punta muna tayo kay John Locke, no? Pag sinabi natin kay John Locke, he manifested or established what we call the separation of powers. John Locke is the social contract theory. On the other hand, kay Montesquieu naman yung separation of powers. Tapos yung kay Rousseau naman, it has something to do with civil liberty and natural rights. Okay? So, itong particular concepts na to that were shared or inspired from this particular Enlightenment period thinkers, Americans observed these ideas and built a democratic republic and still practices unity and of course federalism within the 13 states. They didn't want a monarchy or a dictatorship because they saw the trauma from King George III's rule. Right? So let's now delve historically on the causes or the factors that pushed for the American Revolution. But before we go into that, gusto ko lang i-highlight yung mga different layers or lenses na ginagamit pagdating sa pag-view ng American Revolution. Okay? Because there are a lot of scholars besides Stoughton and Wood who viewed the American Revolution differently. Yung iba, ng mga non-political science related or non-colonial related studies na mga individuals, they viewed the American Revolution as something that was needed or necessary. Yung mga yung mga human rights related na mga scholars, they saw the American Revolution as something that was needed as well because it manifested or showed the coherence of activism at the same time fighting for oppression against the British rule. Okay? But let's start with the four particular views that manifest the American Revolution. So number one, it's the radical view. Second would be the conservative view. Third would be the economic or materialist view. And fourth would be the imperial or global view. So sa radical view, the revolution was transformative. So how was it transformative? Of course, it manifested the Enlightenment ideals and demands for liberty and equality. And with that, it really transformed the socio-societal aspect and landscape of America because it learned from the trauma that it experienced from the British rule, which was more on the absolute monarchy type of regime from King George III's rule. Okay, what about the conservative view? So sa conservative view naman, it was about protecting the rights of the colonists already had, not radically changing society. Kumbaga, ang tinitingnan lang dito is that there is no need to actually change the American society kasi it was already good or effective as it is. Kumbaga, parang tinotolerate ng conservative view yung yung point na there's no need for the American Revolution to embed democratic changes because it will naturally come or it will naturally um, happen kung mawawala man or susuko man yung mga British colonizers, there is no need for the American Revolution to happen. But again, historically speaking, the American Revolution happened and it really did change, no, yung whole political and social landscape of America. Third one, it's the economic and materialist view. So, yung economic and materialist view naman, it is viewing the American Revolution as a product of the taxation, the heavy taxation or the taxation without representation, trade restrictions, and class economic tensions that happened between the British and the American people. Okay, and lastly, we have the imperial or the global view. So according to the imperial or global view, it was the outcome of British imperial overreach and international power struggles that pushed for the American Revolution to happen. Kasi, economically speaking again, America was in the verge of pressuring itself into opening its borders when it comes to sea trade, no? Or conducting trade with other neighboring and non-neighboring countries. So the American Revolution was just a push forward for the British rule to go out and for them to be independent on their own when it comes to doing trade. At yung imperial or global view nito is that diplomatic ties, bilateral ties wasn't so much of practiced or it wasn't evident during the time of the 1700s up to the 1800s. Kaya, for America, in order for it to keep up with the global standards or the global norms, it should involve itself with global trade. And that wasn't fully possible for them if the British rule would intervene. Okay? Okay, let's now proceed to the actual causes of the revolution. Kanina kasi tinignan lang natin yung yung mga particular views over the American Revolution, yung mga lenses, no? Pero dito titignan natin yung mga actual events, mga actual factors that actually pushed for the American Revolution. But again, I'm not limiting you guys to also do your research about ano nga ba yung mga naging actual causes, no? Actual events, sabihin nating mga actions of the British rule that pushed for the American revolutionaries to revolt. Okay? Alright, so based on my own research and even on Stoughton and Wood's readings or literature, ito yung mga nag-emerge na mga most important causes of the American Revolution. And the first cause or first area would be the political tensions and conflicts, which involve both policies and sabihin nating actions towards the British and American rule. Versus the economic pressures, which is the second one, which focus on the economic transactions such as mercantilism and trade restrictions. And dyan din pumapasok yung colonial taxation that basically is a good manifestation between the Franco-British War or the original World War that happened for 7 years. And lastly, we have the ideological and social influences, which again derives from the three Enlightenment period thinkers that we have discussed earlier on. Okay, so let's start. So dito muna tayo sa political tensions and conflicts. Okay, so bullet number 1. So the actual Great Britain and North America conflict, or what we call as well the Franco-British War, that actually happened between uh the Canadian, at the same time the east of the Mississippi River. This is where the actual conflict happened between these two forces, which are the Great Britain and the North America. So ano ba yung nangyari dyan? No? So what happened is basically nagkaroon ng representation tong mga Indian, at the same time mga French. So ang nire-represent nitong mga French is basically yung mga Americans who were also fighting for their freedom from the British rule, versus the Indian War, who were mostly, of course, representing of the British rule. So what happened? It was basically the what we call the 7 years war that happened. Kasi nagkaroon ng mga tax conflicts between the two parties, no? And it ended up as a very hostile or a very bloody war against these two forces. So yung particular war na yan, it is a symbolizing cause of the American Revolution. Because for the reason that it pushed for the notion na yung mga French people who were again allies of the American revolutionaries at that time, nagkaroon sila ng influence in terms of what they are fighting for, which is more on the civil liberties and economic freedom. Okay? Because even the French people experienced that type of exploitation from the Bourbon monarchy. And meron siyang ideological influence over the American revolutionaries that came from the ideological and social influences. Okay? So another factors or political factors that pushed for the American Revolution. So dito pumapasok yung mga particular policies or key acts na tinatawag natin. So we have the Stamp Act from 1765. We have the Townshend Acts from the 1767. We have the Tea Act from 1773. And we have the Intolerable Acts from 1774. So ano ba yung nire-represent ng mga acts na to? Okay? So pag sinabi natin Stamp Act, number 1, is it talks about the particular goods, particular trading activities that can be done between the American people versus other countries or other nations. So the Stamp Act, what it represented from 1765 is basically it limited the it limited the transactions of the American people when it comes to trading with other people. And with that, they had to get a particular approval or act with the British rule at that time. Okay? And also, malaki yung implication ng Stamp Act, because it sought to raise money to pay for this army through a tax on an illegal and official papers and publications circulating in the colonies. Kumbaga, marami kasing issues back then sa British Parliament. At yung ginagawa nitong Stamp Act na to is that yung nare-raise niyang mga taxes from the trade negotiations between the Americans and the other races is pineperahan to ng British government dahil maraming corruption or informal practices that happened during the reign of King George III. Okay, on the other hand, ito namang Townshend Act from 1767. Actually, dalawa yan, 1767 and 1768. It placed indirect taxes on imports, British goods such as mga products like glass, lead, pants, paper, and tea. So yung mga particular products na to, in which of course when they trade nationwide or worldwide, merong mas malaking tax na may impose or mababawas dun sa mga traders. Okay? Okay, so what about the Tea Act that was implemented in 1773? So yung Tea Act naman, it was implemented again by the British Parliament that granted the financially struggling British Indian company, which is the monopoly or the British, the main corporation that allowed American colonies to trade, to actually sell tea at a lower price than before, even with tax included. So ano pa bang ini-incorporate ng Tea Act? So the act also angered colonies not because of the price but because it reinforced the idea of taxation without representation. Okay? Leading to the Boston Tea Party, which we will discuss further on, and ultimately contributing to the American Revolutionary War, which is one of the which is viewed as one of the factors why the American Revolutionary War happened in the first place. Okay, so what about the intolerable acts of 1774? So what is it about? So the intolerable acts or the coercive acts in other terms of 1774, kumbaga parang series or group of punitive laws siya that was passed by the British Parliament, which was a response to the Boston Tea Party. Kasi yung Boston Tea Party was considered to be an act of rebellion from the American revolutionaries. At ang ginawa nito basically is to punish yung mga colony that, and of course ang ginawa nila is to basically make the colonies uh, severely struggle in terms of economic dependence, kasi at that time, since the 13 colonies were largely dependent on the taxes and the laws that were implemented by the British Parliament, hinigpitan nila yung mga other colonies that were largely involved within the Boston Tea Party. Okay? And lastly, another factor of the American Revolution is the no taxation without representation. So, colonial resistance to British parliamentary authority, meaning wala kasing representative ang British Parliament. Wala kasing representative ang mga Americans that time sa British Parliament. And with that, tong mga in-instill na mga acts or mga policies na to, they were purely created or crafted by the British Parliament on their own, or the British people on their own, without consulting the Americans at that time. Pero yung actual suffering, it was mostly experienced by the American people. Okay? Alright, let's now go to the economic pressures. So the practices or the economic practices that were largely involved that let's say were restricted by the British government were mercantilism and trade restrictions. So ito yung mga practices that were sabihin nating weakened or sabihin nating limited by the British government at that time, because the British government only wanted the trade transactions on their own. So yung mga restrictions nila sa trade and mercantilism, this triggered the American revolutionaries in a large manner. Kaya nga sabi, di ba, the American Revolutionary War was largely caused by economic restrictions by the British government. Okay? So yung weak policy making at decision making na experience ng mga American revolutionaries, this was something that was sabihin natin devastating to them, not only in the high levels of middle or rich class families, but more on the grassroots level. Okay? Kasi yung mga nasa grassroots level, they were mostly Americans who were dependent on middle class or rich class business owners when it comes to their employment. And without having the middle or the rich class being stable economically, of course, these people from the grassroots level would also severely suffer. Kaya yung mga people from the American Revolutionary War were mostly from the poor class. Okay? Alright, so another economic pressure that manifested as the cause of the American Revolution was, of course, again, the British debt from the post Seven Years' War that happened here between the French and Indians. So the Seven Years' War that took place, no, from the Mississippi River and the Canadian lands, it actually resulted to a lot of financial burdens towards the British government. And with that, ang only way ng British government to get on or to recover from that financial loss was to increase taxation, okay, towards the Americans. So Britain was not able to provide effective tax allocations and transparency in the American economy. And corruption was very rampant or very commonly practiced by the authority. Okay? And lastly, it's the ideological and social influences, which we have already discussed earlier. So, sa mga Enlightenment period thinkers like John Locke, who was known for his social contract theory, and of course, Montesquieu for his separation of powers, and we also have John Jacques Rousseau, who, of course, pushed for civil liberties. At the same time, he also pushed for ano no, he also pushed for natural rights and of course human freedom, no? So these particular thinkers have pushed or helped the American revolutionaries to really find a particular dream or a particular objective in where what they want America to be after they eradicate the British colonial rule. Okay? So yung pinaka nagmamanifest na ideological and social influence sa mga American revolutionaries were republicanism. Okay? And at the same time, yung, of course, the desire for self-government. So, these particular concepts that you would see here, these are a good reminiscence of the Native American political system. So, as you can recall from our past lesson, dun sa may Native America and the European colonization, we could actually relate the tribal council and how the AIM or the African Indian movement, the American Indian movement have fought for their own self-identity and self-government. Particularly when it comes to political decisions, when it comes to economic practices, when it comes to policy making, and that is seen to be a good inspiration for the American revolutionaries. Okay? All right, so let's now go onto the actual key events of the revolution. Kumbaga, ito yung mga three events that are particularly, sabihin nating, um, shaped the whole landscape of what we call American Revolution. So, hinati ko siya into three areas, no? Or three events. The Continental Congress, the outbreak of war, and the turning points. Pag sinabi natin Continental Congress, I would like to highlight there the collective gathering or the collective events that happened between the American colonists at the same time the British government. So, on the other hand, meron tayong outbreak of war. Kumbaga, ito yung parang naging breaking point of how the Americans versus the British people came into a battle or a conflict, physical conflict. And of course, that led to many uprisings within the British government. And lastly, we have the Battle of Saratoga from 1777 and of course the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war between the British and the American people. Okay, sige, himayin natin to isa-isa. Let's start first with the Continental Congress, highlighting the Boston Tea Party and the First and Second Continental Congress. But first, let me have a 1 minute water break. Alright, so thank you for waiting. So, going back to the lesson. So, we will first highlight the Continental Congress. So, ano ba yung nag-emerge na events dito? Basically, the Boston Tea Party and the First and Second Continental Congress. Alright, so dito muna tayo sa Boston Tea Party that happened on December 16, 1773. Okay. So itong Boston Tea Party is considered to be one of the earliest or the first revolutionary act by the American revolutionaries against the British colonizers or the British government. So ano ba nangyari dito sa may Boston Tea Party? So the Boston Tea Party was actually an aftermath of the taxation without representation. Ang pinaka-pinapoint nito is that the colonists proposed new taxes imposed by the British Parliament. Ang ina-argue nila is that they should not be taxed without having elected representatives in the British Parliament. The phrase no taxation without representation became a rallying cry for the American revolutionaries. Okay? And with that, of course, ang nangyari is na-involve yung dalawang acts that we have involved earlier. So, dito pumapasok yung Townshend Act. At the same time, yung Tea Act. Okay? So, tungkol saan nga ba ulit yung Townshend Act? Yung Townshend Act, it was actually passed in 1767. Okay? Like, ilang years siya. So, 4 years after the Boston Tea Party. So, nung pinas siya sa noong 1767, these acts levied taxes on imported goods like ayun nga, glass, paint, and tea. While most repelled in 1770 due to colonial boycotts. So, yung tax on tea was deliberately kept to assert parliamentary's authority. On the other hand, yung Tea Act naman, na-implement ito noong 1773 on the same year of the Boston Tea Party or in relation to the Boston Tea Party. Yung Tea Act naman of 1773, again, it was an act designed to help the financially struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies without paying the standard export tax. So of course, this made the company's tea cheaper in terms of price than smuggled tea but maintained the tax mandated by the Townshend Acts. So connected yung dalawang acts na yan. Okay? So yung mga colonial merchants and smugglers protested this perceived monopoly as mentioned. It basically triggered at the same time the British government on going against the uh, American revolutionaries. So what happened in the Boston Tea Party is basically a very chaotic type of scenario. So a group of American colonists, many associated with the Sons of Liberty, which is basically the group of revolutionaries, boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 storage or chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. What you should take note is that the teas back then, during the time of 1770s to 1800s, even in the early 1900s, they valued tea as a form of elitism. Kasi yung mga nakakabili lang ng mga tea back then were more of the elites kasi mahal talaga siya. Okay? So the fact that the American revolutionaries or the Sons of Liberty were able to dump or to throw out the 342 chests of tea in the Boston Harbor, ang nangyari is of course the British government were devastated at the same time angered by this particular revolutionary act. Okay? So the protest was a direct action against British taxation policies like the taxation without representation and the perceived monopoly of the East India Company that I mentioned earlier. Si East India Company was the main institution or company that managed the supply at the same time the trade activities of Britain at that time. But again, it was hardly imposing taxes. It was hardly exploiting the American people when it comes to hiring taxes when it comes to trade practices. And with that, this wasn't so much of a very favorable or welcoming thing for the American people, right? All right. So what about the Continental Congress for the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress? Okay. So these are series of Continental Congress that happened on nearly just 1 year, no? So 1774, then 1775. So ano ba yung naging point or naging uh, rationale behind the Continental Congress? So yung Continental Congress muna is a body or a collective body that served as the government of the 13 American colonies. Kumbaga dyan nagtitipon-tipon, nagsasama-sama yung mga representatives ng mga American colonies. Okay? So that happened from 1774 up to 1789 or nag-exist sila from this particular year. So, ano bang ginagawa nila dyan? They actually talked about, they discussed about the particular concern that they have against the British colonizers or the British authority. Especially when it comes to employment, taxation, when it comes to salaries of the Americans, especially from the middle and the rich class. So yung mga ganong bagay. Mostly economic and of course may political touch din siya. So dito actually nag-form yung tinatawag nating founding fathers of America, which we will discuss further in the next lesson. Okay? So let's now first discuss muna yung First Continental Congress. So ano ba nangyari sa may First Continental Congress of 1774? Ang naging naging highlight nito was to unite colonial response against British policies. Kumbaga yung parang collective raising of concern nila towards the British colonies or British government. Also, in the First Continental Congress of 1774, they sought to reconcile and protect the colonial rights. Meaning, na kahit under colonize sila ng Britain, they still wanted to feel that it's still their country, it's still their land, because they are originally the people of America. But again, the colonial rights wasn't so much of embraced or protected by the British rule. Because ang belief ni King George III is that if he gives these rights too much towards the colonized, is that they would be more empowered to go against the British government. And King George didn't want that. And lastly, in the First Continental Congress, they also pushed for petitioning economic pressure. Meaning, nagkaroon sila ng mga signatories, ng mga particular signatories at the same time, yung mga petition documents, and where they wanted to show na yung 13 colonies were united in fixing or amending the economic policies towards the colonist or the colonized people. Okay? And besides that, a very important highlight in the First Continental Congress of 1774 is hinighlight nila yung discussion on the intolerable or the coercive acts. So ano nga ba ulit yung intolerable or coercive acts? Basically, ito yung naging punishment ng British government sa mga American people in relation to the Boston Tea Party. Kumbaga, nagkaroon kasi dito ng higher taxation when it comes to trade, when it comes to salaries, doon sa 13 colonies na control ng British government. And with that, a series of measures imposed by the British Parliament after the colonies resisted new tax laws. Kumbaga, these tax laws, in which of course incorporated higher taxes, they were evidently slowing the economic development manifested within the 13 colonies. Kaya napansin ng mga representatives nitong 13 colonies, American colonies, is they should create that particular movement through the First Continental Congress. But what happened is yung First Continental Congress, hindi siya nag-result into a lot of changes towards the control of the British rule over the American people. Okay? Alright, so let's now go to the Second Continental Congress, which happened on the next year, on 1775. So, ano ba naging highlight nitong Second Continental Congress that happened in 1775? So, ang pinaka naging gist nito is to manage the war effort against Britain. Meaning, dito sa may First Continental Congress kasi, hindi naging successful yung ano, no? Hindi naging successful yung sabihin nating negotiations between the 13 American colonies and the representatives. I mean, class, you would see the efforts that the 13 colonies have done, no? Imagine lahat ng mga representatives na to, they came all the way from different different areas of America at pumunta lang sila sa Massachusetts just to gather here and to do the Continental Congress. Pero hindi sila pinakinggan ng British government or ng British rule, particularly ni King George III. Kaya nangyari is they resorted to creating a war or creating a rebellion against the British rule or the British government. So, ang naging point or naging agenda, point of order nitong Second Continental Congress of 1775, it convened due to the Revolutionary War which already begun. Meaning, gusto na nilang atakihin or gusto na nilang gumawa ng resistance that would declare independence. Hindi natuloy or hindi naging successful itong Second Continental Congress gawa ng Revolutionary War already happened. Or nagkaroon na ng attacks yung mga revolutionaries against the British Parliament. Okay? Right, ito naman yung tinatawag natin na outbreak of war. Pupunta na tayo sa part ng outbreak of war, which started in 1775, which involved the battles of Lexington and Concord. Tapos na tayo sa Continental Congress, hindi nagtagumpay yung dalawang Continental Congress. So the Americans or the revolutionaries resorted to a more hostile or physically evident warfare between the British rule or British Army and the American Army, right? So the outbreak of war. So this involves the battles of Lexington and Concord and formation of the Continental Army. So what was the outbreak of war of the Lexington and Concord about? So it is very typical, no? Na pagka nagkakaroon ng war, it's about gaining authority, gaining control over the particular land or particular group. But itong battles of Lexington and Concord, it manifested or it showed a deeper objective or a deeper purpose in American history. Okay? So the battles of Lexington and Concord were actually the official first military engagements of the American Revolutionary War against the British colonial rule. So, ang na-involved dito were about 700 British Army regulars lang under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. So, si Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith was considered to be the head of military at that time. Okay? In 1775, I think up to 1779. So, si Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, what they were trying to do in the area of the Concord and Lexington is they want to capture and destroy the military base and supplies of the militia at Concord in Massachusetts. Meaning dito kasi located yung military base ng mga American revolutionaries. So nagpadala si Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith ng 700 British Army to destroy nga and to eliminate this particular arms and weapons of the American revolutionaries. But the thing is, they weren't able to do this fully. Because yung mga American revolutionaries, they were also prepared to fight against the British Army. So, umatake sila or they fought against the British Army by, of course, engaging themselves into a particular barricade in where they protected themselves by particular weapons, particular objects. And of course, since kabisado ng mga American revolutionaries tong Massachusetts particularly, is mas alam nila yung ways to strategize on fighting physically against the British Army. So at this time, ang na-appoint na commander ng Continental Army, by the way, the Continental Army is this. This is the representation of the 13 colonies of America. Ang naging leader niyan ay si George Washington, which was the first president. Hindi pa siya, ano nito, no? Hindi pa siya officially a president, but he was the commander of the Continental Army in 1775. So, he held the American military together long enough to secure victory at Yorktown and independence for his nation in 1781. So, George Washington is a very historical individual, not only as a president, but as a revolutionary himself. Because again, he led the actual particular battles of Lexington and Concord. Kasi ito yung naging signifying battle on how they would go against the British colonial rule. And the fact that they won this particular battle, it's a particular testament na merong capacity si George Washington to really go against the British rule, and he really loved the independence for his country, which is America. Okay? But later on, noong 1781, dito na siya nagkaroon ng emerging role with the other founding fathers of the US Constitution and America, which we will discuss further dun sa next lesson natin. Right? So by the way, ito pala yung tinatawag nating Continental Army. Okay? So sila yung sabihin nating merged group of representatives of armies from the 13 colonies. So although numbers varied as soldiers came and went, so maraming mga namatay, maraming bago, through the 8 years na naging active tong Continental Army, a total of, well, as believed by historians, pero hindi pa naman to sure talaga, pero historians believe that approximately 230,000 soldiers have served in the Continental Army. Okay? So again, the Continental Army was composed of United Colonies representing the 13 colonies that we mentioned earlier on. And of course, they led the United States during the American Revolutionary War. Right? So, besides that, yung Continental Army, when it was established in 1775 under the rule of George Washington, yung yung aftermath ng battle nila with the Lexington and Concord, nagkaroon yun ng parang malaking indication of victory and honor within the members of the Continental Army. Because class in America, maraming mga at present, maraming mga sundalo or mga army members both from the Navy, from the Army, at the same time the Air Force, who are actually relatives or parang descendants of the Continental Army. So yung iba sa kanila, parang mga sabihin nating tinatawag na legacy na nitong Continental Army. Kumbaga ito kasi yung naging first emergence of US Army. Dito sila nakakuha ng idea about the relevance of having a trained army that would go against potential threats, potential colonizers. Kaya even up to the present day, binavalue nila yung role ng military, lalo dito sa Amerika. Okay? Kaya ganoon na lang yung pagbavalue nila when it comes to training Americans for possible warfare. Okay? Okay, since tapos na tayo dito sa may key revolution, sa may outbreak of war pala, between the battles of Lexington and the Continental Army that was under Washington, we will now go to the turning points. Yung turning points naman, technically, these are the aftermath or ano ba yung nangyari like from the uh, Boston Tea Party, and where of course it led to the First Continental Congress, and of course since the Continental Congress didn't work on their end, it led to the Lexington and Concord, and of course with the intervention of the Continental Army of Washington, may mga naging aftermath that signifies the events of the American Revolution. At ito yung Battle of Saratoga and of course the Treaty of Paris. So itong dalawang key events na to are basically what transpires the aftermath of the American Revolution. So i-tackle natin silang dalawa. Okay, so ito na yan. So, the turning points of the Battle of Saratoga and of course the Treaty of Paris. So, ano nga ba yung Treaty of Paris? I think you have heard of it na many times. But the whole point of the Treaty of Paris particularly is this treaty was signed on September 3, 1783 between the American colonies and the Great Britain. This ended the American Revolution and formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. So you might ask, ano ba yung main reason why the Great Britain was able to really surrender? Or paano ba nila natanggap na it's time for them to give up on the war? They gave up on the war for the reason that they were bankrupt. Maraming naging utang si Great Britain sa mga other European powers like Spain, Germany, and they weren't able to really keep up with the demands on how the revolutionaries or the American revolutionaries were adopting to their defense mechanism. And that was very evident with the Battle of Saratoga. Nakita nila on how the American revolutionaries through George Washington were able to go against the tactics or the strategies that they had. Okay? But sorry, I forgot to go first with the Battle of Saratoga before the Treaty of Paris. Pero ayun lang yung naging gist ng Treaty of Paris, okay? As a manifestation or a signifying agreement between the agreement or peace between the Great Britain and US. Pero going back again, dito muna tayo sa sa may Battle of Saratoga, which happened in 1777. The Battle of Saratoga was about the intervention of the French army with the American forces. So this particular battle happened in 1777. Okay? So kakonekta siya nitong Battles of Lexington and Concord. Since nangyari ito in 1775, 2 years after, the Battle of Saratoga emerged as something that was more of a turning point for American struggle for independence. Meaning, nagkaroon din siya ng direct impact sa career ni General George Washington at that time. So, the victory of the Saratoga, which is basically would not be possible without the intervention of the French people, and in fate of the war effort, hindi siya mangyayari. Kumbaga, hindi mangyayari yung victory ng US dito if hindi nag-intervene ang French forces. Okay? So, itong final battle na to between the British and American forces, it signified a higher being na it's time for the British government to give up and surrender against the American revolutionaries. And nagkaroon sila of course, ng signifying agreement through the Treaty of Paris. Kasi itong final battle na to sa Saratoga, it meant that the British government wanted to test the waters if they could still go against the American revolutionaries with their military capacity. And with that, they proved na hindi na kaya or hindi na nila kayang lumaban against the American revolutionaries. So this shattered the notion of Britain's invincibility and played a large role convincing France to support American independence. And with that, again, we will go into the relevance of the Treaty of Paris, which is, of course, involving the actual agreement between the American colonies and the Great Britain. The 13 colonies and the Great Britain. Okay? So, class, dito na pumapasok yung role ng importance ng founding fathers of America. At dyan pumapasok sila John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, which are basically the people who signed the Treaty of Paris on behalf of the 13 colonies. Right? So, itong tatlong tao na to, we will discuss them in our next lesson. But the whole point is that they signified signing the Treaty of Paris for the reason that among their represented colonies in America at that time, sila yung may highest distinct positions in their own government. Okay? Okay. So, meron two very important provisions yung treaty or Treaty of Paris. So, number one, British recognition of U.S. independence and the alienation of boundaries that would allow for American Western expansion. What we mean by this is that recognition of U.S. independence is that at the end of the day, legally speaking, socially speaking, the British colony no longer have a control or dominating power over the 13 colonies. Kumbaga, the US government, may it be as a a unilateral component or as independent 13 states, they have their own sovereignty, they have their own freedom to decide what will be their political identity, their economic decisions, and whatsoever. And on the other hand, yung delineation of boundaries naman, this talks about the the tangible aspect, meaning the American government or the Americans are allowed or they would be able to expand on their own in terms of boundaries, in terms of territorial jurisdiction, and whatsoever. So that's how the 13 colonies have largened and became 50 colonies at present. Kasi they were able to find more lands, find more spaces for them to control as a government, and that's how we could see how America transformed into this big territorial sovereign country. Okay. All right. So we have tackled all these three areas as the key events of the American Revolution. So I hope you have learned something from them. Okay, so hindi siya natatapos, no? Because even after the American Revolution, there is a good question that we should address as scholars of political science. So, according to Stoughton, in support of Wood, would you agree that the American Revolution was primarily a fight for economic independence? Or was it driven more by ideological and political concerns? So, in my own opinion, as your teacher, I would say that it was more or largely for economic independence. But that economic independence wouldn't suffice or wouldn't be attained without the ideological and political influences that go or went along with that process or journey of gaining that economic independence. But these are the particular impacts of the revolution that I would say are very factual or important. So I have divided it into three impacts. So social impact. So the impact on various social groups, including women, Native Americans, African Americans, and loyalists. I would say that even though the independence or the revolution have emerged, it did not directly provided a perfect social arena or a perfect social climate for America. Because again, it's a normal consequence naman that even though as a nation you are independent or you have won on a certain revolution, is that people would always be people in terms of how they select the group that they want to belong to. And people will always be territorial. There would always be tribal in a way. So of course, even though freedom was attained in terms of political identity, they had their own constitution, the 1787 constitution, is that these groups of people like women, African American, even Asian, weren't really united, no? In an instant. Kumbaga, it is still a battle for a battle for democracy that we could unite these people. But I don't believe in such thing. There would always be divisions between people, no? Lalo at magkakaiba ng cultural background, political background, ideology, history ang mga tao, and we cannot really fully unite them as a whole. But we could unite them as one Americans. As mentioned nga, di ba, the America was sabihin natin, inspired to have an independent federal 13 states. But at the end of the day, it should be unitary when it comes to economic practices like trade, at the same time foreign policy, and national defense. Kumbaga yung mga bigger scope of issues, of concerns, dapat yun yung pagtuunan ng pansin na sa unitary state. Pero yung mga 13 colonies or 13 states, they could have their own separate or independent identities kasi magkakaiba sila ng nagkakaiba sila ng cultural, historical, and even geographical status. Okay? Besides that, social impact, yung idea ng egalitarian ideas, no? Ideals. Despite continued social hierarchies. So, ano ba ang inaano natin? Ano ba ang pina-point out natin pagka egalitarian? So, of course, when you speak of egalitarian ideals, we are believing in the principle that people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities. And with this, tong egalitarian ideals na to, it manifested in the three tenets of US Constitution, the liberty, freedom, and democracy. And even in the present day, America, through its foreign policies, well, I'm not sure because si Trump yun nakaupo, it still is trying to maintain that kind of notion that we are a democratic, free, at the same time, libertarian type of government in where we are trying to give the best opportunities equally to our people. But again, that is still up for debate, and I doubt that because a lot of inequalities when it comes to race, gender is evidently present in America. Okay? Right. So, dito naman tayo sa political impact. So, dito pumapasok yung first, the Articles of Confederation. I don't know if you're familiar with this particular um, particular legal mandate, but basically ang pino-point out lang naman ng ng Articles of Confederation is that it was one of the earliest written document that provided the original or the basic function of the national government. Pero hindi pa siya focused mainly dun sa three branches of government that much. Although it manifested the thinking or the Enlightenment ideology of Montesquieu about the separation of powers, pero hindi siya ganun ka vivid about how it would practice the function of the legislation when it comes to the interpretation of the laws and whatsoever. Okay? But rather, more focus siya dun lang sa sabihin natin sa raising of funds, about sa trade, sa mga ganong aspect, more of the foreign policy, economic aspect. Okay? Pero dun sa may actual signing of the Constitution by the founding fathers, mas nagkaroon sila ng idea when it comes to improving and evolving the US Constitution when it comes to economic, political, and social areas. Okay? Okay, second, so the development of the Federal Republic through the US Constitution and Bill of Rights from 1787 to 1791. So, of course, this particular US Constitution or Bill of Rights wouldn't really occur without, of course, gaining that independence from the British colonial rule. Wait a minute, class ha. May urgent matter. Right, so going back, so the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights are, of course, an after product of the American Revolution. And, of course, it's a huge credit taking for the Treaty of Paris, in which, of course, it granted that official agreement of the Great Britain and the United States to no longer engage in conflict or in warfare. But what you should take note about the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that during the time that it was developed from 1787 to 1791 is that it had a lot of lapses in it. So, syempre, you cannot expect a constitution to be fully diverse or accepting kagad. Even when the US Constitution started, it did not welcome the voting rights of women. At the same time, it did not consider the LGBTQ rights or the racial considerations towards African American or Asian. But again, the important thing is nagkaroon na ng framework or ng important involvement itong US Constitution in incorporating the three tenets that we mentioned, like the freedom, liberty, and democracy. Right. Then, lastly, global influence. So, how the success of the American Revolution influenced subsequent revolutions, such as the French Revolution and independence movements in Latin America. So, the global influence of the American Revolution in terms for pushing other, sabihin nating, non-Western and Western countries to really fight for their independence from totalitarian or monarchies have been really evident because the American Revolution as itself is a manifestation of how it wanted to create its own political identity, state identity, and of course, at the same time, freeing its colonies from the rule that the British colony have imbibed is a huge indication of how it succeeded, no? And of course, it was heard, it was seen by a lot of countries, and they used that rhetoric that was manifested within this particular event from the American Revolution. Okay? And lastly, emergence of democratic ideals and self-government in other nations. So the Philippines itself is a huge fan of the American government, no? Well, we were colonized, so I suppose baka naging fan na rin yung government natin ng federalism or ng republicanism. Pero many Latin American countries, even Asian countries, well, mostly Malaysia, the Philippines, even slightly Singapore were influence about the democratic ideals and practices that was practiced by the America. And with that, they also saw that there is a good economic prowess or development attributed to it rather than just the social or political benefits. So I guess we're done with the lesson. I hope you learned something from it. Please refer to this um, lesson or this lecture. At the same time, Stoughton and Woods